The Invisible Thread. Phoebe Winters arranged the poetry books with methodical precision, her fingers tracing the spines with reverence. 29 years of life, and the Jefferson City Public Library remained her sanctuary. The books never judged. Her quietness never demanded she be more extroverted, more adventurous. Unlike her sister Naomi, who constantly pushed her to live a little. "You're coming tonight," Naomi had declared that morning over their weekly breakfast, sliding a flyer across the table. "The Human Connection Project, downtown square. No excuses." Phoebe had reluctantly agreed, if only to stop Naomi's persistent campaign to pull her out of her comfort fortress, as she called it. The autumn evening air carried a hint of wood smoke as Phoebe approached the downtown square. String lights crisscrossed overhead, illuminating clusters of people engaged in various activities. A chalkboard sign read, "The Human Connection Project, Rediscovering Ourselves Through Others." Phoebe hugged her cardigan tighter. She should have worn something warmer, but truthfully, she hadn't planned on staying long, just long enough to tell Naomi she had participated. "First-timer?" A woman with silver-streaked hair offered Phoebe a program. "Each station explores a different aspect of human connection. No pressure. Just experience what feels right." Phoebe nodded, scanning the square. There was a deep listening tent, a shared stories circle, and several other stations that made her palms sweat just thinking about participating. Then she spotted something less intimidating. A young man holding a sign that simply said, "Connection through touch, consensual hugs." Unlike the other stations buzzing with activity, he stood alone. Perhaps others found it too intimate as well. The man caught her gaze and smiled without expectation. He was tall with warm brown skin and eyes that crinkled at the corners. A camera hung around his neck. Something about his solitary position amid the crowd tugged at Phoebe. She recognized that feeling, being surrounded yet separate. Before she could rationalize herself out of it, she approached him. "How does this work?" she asked, immediately regretting the awkward phrasing. "However you want," he replied, his voice carrying a gentle lilt. "Some people want a quick embrace, others need a moment longer. Some share why they came, others prefer silence. I'm Julian, by the way." "Phoebe?" She hesitated. "I've never hugged a stranger before." Julian lowered his sign. "We don't have to. We could just talk." "No," Phoebe surprised herself. "I want to try. That's the point of this, right? Connection." Julian opened his arms without stepping forward, allowing her to initiate. Phoebe moved tentatively into the embrace. His arms closed around her with gentle pressure. Not too tight, not too loose. Perfect, somehow. She had expected awkwardness, but instead found unexpected comfort. 5 seconds passed, then 10. When they separated, something shifted in the air between them. "Thank you," Julian said. "May I ask why you chose this station?" Phoebe considered deflecting, but found herself answering honestly. "You looked as out of place as I feel." Julian's laugh was unexpectedly rich. "I'm documenting the project for a photo essay. This was supposed to be observation only, but then I got curious about what it feels like from the other side." "So, I'm your first stranger hug too?" Phoebe smiled. "You are?" He lifted his camera. "Would you mind if I took your photo? For the project? Just your hands if you prefer anonymity." Something about his respectful approach made her brave. "You can photograph my face." As Julian adjusted his lens, Phoebe noticed the fine lines around his eyes, the careful way he framed his shot. Not just taking, but seeing. "What brought you here tonight, Phoebe?" he asked from behind the camera. "My sister thinks I need more connection," she admitted. "She's probably right." The camera lowered. "And what do you think?" The question lingered between them. No one had asked what she thought in a long time. I think... Phoebe paused, searching for words. I think connection is terrifying. And necessary. Like breathing underwater. Julian's expression softened. That's the most honest answer I've heard all night. When Phoebe left the square an hour later, after unexpectedly participating in 2 more stations with Julian nearby, she carried something new. A business card with his email, the promise of seeing the photographs, and the lingering warmth of a moment that felt strangely like the beginning of something. Neither could have known then how that simple exchange, a hug between strangers, would unravel the carefully ordered patterns of their lives and weave something entirely new. Paper lanterns. 3 weeks passed before Phoebe saw Julian again. Autumn deepened into November, painting Jefferson City in amber and rust. She had emailed him twice. First, a polite thank you for the photographs he'd sent, including one candid shot that captured her mid-laugh, a rare sight even to her, and second, to respond to his thoughtful questions about her work at the library. Their exchanges were brief but lingered in her mind throughout her days, shelving books and helping patrons. You keep checking your phone, Naomi observed during their Sunday dinner. Hot date with your e-reader? Phoebe ignored the tease. The Autumn Lantern Festival is tonight. I thought I might go. Naomi's fork clattered against her plate. Without me dragging you, who are you and what have you done with my sister? I like lanterns, Phoebe replied, though the truth was more complicated. Julian had mentioned photographing the festival in his last email. The riverfront park glowed with hundreds of paper lanterns when Phoebe arrived. Families and couples strolled along pathways illuminated by softly glowing orbs of red, gold, and white. Musicians played traditional instruments on a small stage, the melodies carried by the crisp evening breeze. Phoebe wandered through the crowd, her eyes scanning for Julian's tall figure. She felt foolish suddenly. What were the chances he'd even be here tonight? And if he was, would he want company? Their connection at the Human Connection Project might have been just that, a momentary intersection of 2 separate paths. Phoebe? She turned to find Julian standing nearby, camera in hand. His surprise mirrored her own. You came, he said, as if he'd been hoping for exactly this. For the lanterns, she answered, gesturing vaguely at the glowing scene around them. Julian smiled, seeing through her casual explanation. Of course. They're beautiful. Would you like to walk together? I'm trying to capture the reflection of the lanterns on the water. They strolled along the riverbank, stopping occasionally for Julian to frame a shot. Phoebe found herself relaxing in his presence, their conversation flowing more easily than she'd expected. I grew up in a small coastal town in Oregon, Julian told her as they paused to watch a family release a lantern over the water. My father was a fisherman. Every morning before dawn, I'd help him prepare the boat. Is that where you learned photography? Phoebe asked. No, that came later. After my father died, heart attack on his boat when I was 16, I couldn't bear to look at the ocean for a while. He adjusted his camera strap. My high school counselor gave me an old film camera. Said I needed a new way to see the world. The simple intimacy of his disclosure touched Phoebe. People rarely shared their vulnerabilities with her, perhaps sensing her own careful boundaries. What about you? Julian asked. Have you always loved books? Since before I could read them, Phoebe admitted. My mother was often absent. Emotionally, I mean. Books were reliable companions. They took me places without requiring me to actually go anywhere. And now you help others find their escapes, Julian observed. I never thought of it that way. Phoebe considered his perspective. Maybe that's why I've stayed so long. The library feels like purpose and safety combined. They reached a small dock extending into the river. Hundreds of lanterns drifted on the current, creating a galaxy of warm light against the dark water. Other festival goers had gathered to watch, their voices hushed in collective appreciation. "May I?" Julian gestured to a spot beside her on the dock's edge. Phoebe nodded and he sat down, their shoulders almost touching. He set his camera aside, a gesture that didn't escape her notice. "Sometimes it's better to just experience a moment," he explained, following her gaze to his unused camera. "Not everything needs documentation." A lantern drifted particularly close to the dock, its light illuminating their faces. In that glow, Phoebe studied Julian's profile, the thoughtful set of his mouth, the quiet intensity in his eyes. He was present in a way few people were, fully inhabiting the moment rather than merely passing through it. "I've never traveled," Phoebe confessed suddenly. "Not really. Weekend trips with Naomi, but never anywhere that required a passport." Julian turned to her. "Why not?" The question wasn't judgmental, merely curious, but Phoebe felt the weight of all her unexamined choices. Fear, probably, of the unknown, of being uncomfortable, of not belonging anywhere. Yet you came to the Human Connection Project, and here tonight. Julian's voice softened. "Maybe you're braver than you realize." A lantern nearby caught fire, flames leaping suddenly from its paper frame. Several people gasped, but before panic could spread, the burning lantern sank beneath the surface, extinguished by the very water that had carried it. "Beautiful and temporary," Julian murmured. "What is?" Phoebe asked. "All of it. The lanterns, this festival." He paused. Moments of connection. Something shifted in Phoebe's chest, a tightening that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Julian was leaving. He'd mentioned his nomadic lifestyle in their emails. This friendship, or whatever was forming between them, had an expiration date. "When do you leave Jefferson City?" she asked, voicing the question that had hovered unspoken. 2 weeks. There's an environmental conference in Colorado I'm covering next." Julian hesitated. "But I'm finding it harder to imagine leaving than I expected." The admission hung between them, fragile as a paper lantern. Phoebe didn't know how to respond. Her life was here, predictable, safe, contained. His was everywhere else, fluid, unpredictable, expansive. As if sensing her thoughts, Julian reached for his camera again. "Would you mind?" he asked, motioning toward her. Phoebe nodded, expecting him to step back for a proper shot. Instead, he leaned closer, turning the camera to capture both of them against the backdrop of floating lanterns. The impromptu selfie caught her by surprise, her eyes wide, lips parted in a half-smile, while Julian looked directly at the camera with quiet certainty. "There," he said, showing her the image. "Proof that we were here, in this moment." Walking home later that night, Phoebe realized she'd done something unprecedented. She'd made plans to see Julian again before he left, a deliberate choice to continue whatever this connection was becoming. Like the lanterns on the river, it might be beautiful and temporary. But unlike before, the temporary nature didn't deter her from experiencing it fully. For the first time in years, Phoebe felt herself drifting away from the shore of her carefully constructed life drawn by currents she couldn't quite name. The cartography of chance. "You're seeing him again?" Naomi leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Phoebe select a scarf with uncharacteristic deliberation. "That's the 3rd time this week." "We're just having coffee," Phoebe replied, though the flutter in her stomach suggested otherwise. In the 10 days since the Lantern Festival, she and Julian had fallen into an easy rhythm of meeting whenever his photography schedule allowed. "Right. Just coffee, just lunch, just a walk in the park." Naomi's tone was teasing, but her expression held concern. "You do know he's leaving in 4 days, right?" Phoebe's hands stilled on the soft fabric of her scarf. "Of course I know that." "And you're okay with it? Getting attached to someone who doesn't stay?" The question struck at the heart of Phoebe's growing unease. She wasn't impulsive by nature. Her life operated on careful planning and minimized risks. Yet here she was, investing emotional energy in a connection with a built-in endpoint. "I'm not sure okay is the right word," Phoebe admitted. "But I'm choosing it anyway." Naomi's expression softened. "Well, that's new, and maybe good. Just be careful with your heart, Phoebes." At Riverstone Cafe, Julian was already waiting, his camera bag on the chair beside him and a steaming mug between his hands. The smile that lit his face when he spotted Phoebe sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I ordered your usual," he said, nodding to the chai latte waiting across from him. It struck Phoebe then, the strangeness of having a usual with someone she'd known less than a month, how quickly patterns could form, creating the illusion of permanence. "Thanks." She settled into the chair, unwinding her scarf. "How was the university shoot?" Julian launched into a story about photographing the astronomy department, his hands animating the tale of ancient telescopes and eccentric professors. Phoebe found herself watching his expressions as much as listening to his words, the way his eyebrows arched when emphasizing a point, the slight dimple that appeared with certain smiles, the focused intensity when he described framing a particularly challenging shot. "I'm talking too much," he said suddenly, catching her observation. "Tell me about your day." "Nothing nearly as interesting. Helped Mrs. Landingham find Mediterranean cookbooks. Organized the new fiction display. Rescued a spider from the terrified teenager in the study room." "Saved a life, then," Julian grinned. "Sounds plenty interesting to me." This was what drew Phoebe to him. How he found value in the small moments she'd always dismissed as mundane. Through Julian's lens, her quiet life gained texture and significance she'd never recognized. "I got a call this morning," Julian said after a comfortable silence. "From National Geographic." Phoebe's heart stuttered. "That's incredible. What did they want?" "They've seen my work on indigenous water protectors. They're doing a feature series next year and want me to contribute." His expression was a mixture of excitement and something more complex. "It would mean extended time in several remote locations: Argentina, New Zealand, northern Canada." "When would you leave?" Phoebe asked, already calculating the accelerated timeline of their goodbye. "That's the thing," Julian set down his mug. "The first assignment wouldn't start until February, 3 months from now." "Oh." Phoebe processed this information, uncertain why it didn't feel like entirely good news. "So Colorado, then back here, then National Geographic?" Julian hesitated. "Actually, I was thinking of extending my stay in Jefferson City, at least through the holidays, if that made sense." The implication hung between them. He was considering staying longer, for her. The prospect both thrilled and terrified Phoebe. "What about your other assignments?" she asked. "I can do most of my freelance work from anywhere with an internet connection." Julian leaned forward. "Phoebe, I know this is fast and complicated, but there's something here I'm not ready to walk away from yet." Before she could respond, Julian's phone buzzed. He glanced at it apologetically. "The university needs me back for one more shot. Can we continue this conversation over dinner? My place? I make a decent risotto." Phoebe nodded, her thoughts swirling as she watched him gather his things. As he turned to leave, he impulsively caught her hand, squeezing it gently before rushing out. That evening, standing outside Julian's rented apartment, Phoebe nearly turned back 3 times. This felt like crossing a threshold, not just into his living space, but into a deeper level of whatever was forming between them. The apartment revealed new dimensions of Julian. Temporary furnishings mingled with carefully chosen personal items, a hand-woven blanket from Peru, black and white prints of ordinary people from his travels, a shelf of dog-eared books. "You travel light," Phoebe observed, noting the sparse possessions. Julian stirred the risotto. Necessity became preference over time. I learned what I actually need versus what I merely want around me. And what do you actually need? The question emerged more weighted than Phoebe intended. Julian's stirring slowed. Connection. Purpose. Beauty. He glanced up at her. Increasingly specific company. The admission hung in the air, fragrant with saffron and possibility. Over dinner, Julian described his nomadic life. The freedom and loneliness intertwined. The constant search for stories worth telling. The growing weariness of temporary attachments. I used to think rootlessness was the ultimate freedom, he confessed. Lately, I'm not so sure. And I always thought staying put meant safety. Phoebe countered. But maybe it's just avoidance dressed as contentment. Later, looking through Julian's portfolio on his laptop, Phoebe glimpsed his world through his eyes. The vastness of Patagonian landscapes, the intimate joy of a Moroccan family's dinner, the quiet dignity of environmental activists standing against corporate giants. You see people, she said. Really see them? Julian's hand found hers. Like I see you. The kiss that followed felt inevitable, gentle at first, then deepening with mutual recognition. When they separated, Phoebe felt a curious sensation of both falling and finding solid ground. Stay, Julian whispered against her hair much later as midnight approached. Phoebe hesitated. I should go home. Not tonight. I meant in my life. His voice held a vulnerability that matched her own. I know it's complicated. My work, your life here. But there might be ways. Phoebe pulled back slightly, studying his face in the dim light. Julian, I've never even left Missouri. You live everywhere and nowhere. How would this actually work? I don't know, he admitted. But I've spent 10 years capturing other people's stories. For the first time, I want to be part of one. With you. Driving home in the early hours, Phoebe felt like a cartographer facing uncharted territory. The map of her life, once so neatly drawn with clear boundaries, now contained an unexplored region marked only with possibility. 4 days until Julian's scheduled departure, a decision about National Geographic looming beyond that, and between, now and then, the unmarked path of a heart opening to risk after years of careful closure. For someone who had always found safety in libraries, in stories already written and endings already determined, Phoebe now found herself in the terrifying, exhilarating position of not knowing how her own story might unfold. Crossroads and constellations. The astronomy exhibition at the Jefferson City Science Center was Julian's last official assignment before his scheduled departure. Phoebe stood beside him as he photographed the interactive galaxy map, watching how he moved with practiced precision, finding angles that transformed ordinary scenes into compelling narratives. The Orion Nebula is my favorite, said Dr. Harding, the enthusiastic curator who had been following them through the exhibition. Over 1,500 light-years away, yet we can still see its beauty. Distance doesn't diminish significance. Julian caught Phoebe's eye, the parallel unmistakable between them. 3 days had passed since their dinner, filled with long conversations about possibilities neither had previously considered. Julian had extended his Colorado trip by 3 days, pushing his departure to the end of the week. It felt like borrowed time, precious and insufficient. Would you like to see something special? Dr. Harding asked, noting their interest. We've just installed the new observatory telescope. It's not open to the public until next month. On the rooftop observatory, the winter sky spread above them in breathtaking clarity. Dr. Harding excused himself after setting up the telescope, leaving them alone beneath the stars. Did you know, Julian said, adjusting the focus, that many of the stars we're seeing might not exist anymore? The light takes so long to reach us that we're essentially looking into the past. Phoebe stepped closer to the telescope. That's both beautiful and sad. Or maybe just honest, Julian replied. Everything exists in its own time. The trick is appreciating the light while it's here. The metaphor wasn't lost on Phoebe. She peered through the eyepiece at a distant cluster of stars, brilliant against the darkness. The Pleiades, Julian explained, also called the Seven Sisters. Like me and Naomi, Phoebe said softly. Connected by circumstance, separated by perspective. She straightened from the telescope. She thinks I'm setting myself up for heartbreak, that we're too different to make this work. Julian leaned against the observatory railing. And what do you think? The question echoed their first meeting, when he'd asked what she thought about connection. Then her answer had been tentative. Now, after weeks of knowing him, Phoebe felt a clarity she hadn't expected. I think I've spent my life afraid of the wrong things, she said. Not of failing or getting hurt, but of actually living, of taking chances. Julian's expression turned serious. I've been thinking about National Geographic. Phoebe's stomach tightened. Here it was, the practical reality interrupting their brief idyll. It's an amazing opportunity. You have to take it. I'm going to, Julian confirmed, but I'm also going to ask for modifications to the schedule. More time between locations. Home base returns. He stepped closer. If I had someone to come home to, the implication hung between them, momentous as the constellations overhead. Julian? Phoebe began, uncertainty creeping in. We've known each other for what, 5 weeks? This is crazy. Probably, he agreed, a smile touching his lips. But consider the statistical improbability of us meeting at all. Out of all the people at that event, we found each other. What are the odds? Astronomical, Phoebe suggested, the pun drawing a laugh from both of them, breaking the tension. Julian took her hand. I'm not asking for promises. Just openness to seeing where this goes. I'll be gone for assignments, yes, but technology exists. And planes. And I've never had a reason to come back to any specific place before. The weight of his words settled around them. It wasn't a traditional relationship he was offering, couldn't be, given his work. But it was honest and real, and possibly worth the risk. I should warn you, Phoebe said, her voice steadier than she felt. I've never been in an actual relationship. My track record with letting people in isn't great. And I've never tried to maintain one across continents, Julian countered. We're both beginners here. The following days passed with bittersweet intensity. Julian packed his belongings while Phoebe helped, learning the efficient system he'd developed through years of transient living. They created routines that felt like practice for a future neither could clearly envision. Morning coffee shared over world news, evening walks through Phoebe's favorite reading spots in the city. On Julian's last night in Jefferson City, Naomi insisted on hosting dinner at her apartment. So, she said, passing Julian the salad bowl, you're really going to try this long-distance thing? Julian nodded. That's the plan. I'll be back in 3 weeks after Colorado. And then gone again for National Geographic, Naomi pointed out. Her tone wasn't unkind, but practical. Phoebe's never even had a boyfriend who lived across town, let alone across oceans. Naomi, Phoebe warned. No, it's a fair concern, Julian said. I've thought about it constantly. This isn't the relationship model I ever expected either. But, Naomi prompted, but sometimes the right person makes you reconsider what you thought were fixed parameters in your life. Julian glanced at Phoebe. I've spent a decade documenting other people's lives. I think it's time I started building my own. Naomi studied him with newfound respect. Well, that's a better answer than I expected. She raised her wine glass. To unconventional beginnings. Later, walking back to Julian's apartment for their last night together, snow began to fall, the first of the season. They paused under a street light, watching flakes illuminate in the glow before vanishing against the dark pavement. "I have something for you," Julian said, reaching into his pocket. He handed Phoebe a small, wrapped package. Inside was a compass, antique brass, with intricate engraving. "It was my father's," Julian explained. "He used it when visibility was poor on the water." Phoebe ran her finger over the smooth metal. "Julian, I can't take this. It's too important." "That's exactly why I want you to have it." His eyes held hers steadily. "A reminder that distance doesn't mean lost, that there are ways to find your path back to what matters." Phoebe felt tears threatening. The gift represented more than a sentimental token. It was Julian entrusting her with a piece of his history, his foundation. "I don't have anything for you," she whispered. Julian's smile was gentle. "You already gave me something I didn't know I was looking for." The snowfall intensified around them, creating a private world of swirling white. Phoebe thought of all the boundaries she'd constructed throughout her life, safety measures against disappointment and hurt. How easily Julian had walked through them, not by force, but by patient invitation. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not just about you leaving, about changing, about wanting something I never thought I'd want." Julian brushed snowflakes from her hair. "Fear means you're paying attention to what matters. What if this doesn't work?" The question that had haunted Phoebe for days finally emerged. What if the distance is too much? What if we're being naive? "Then we'll have tried something brave," Julian answered simply. "And that's worth more than spending a lifetime wondering what might have happened if we'd been courageous enough to try." Morning came too quickly. At the airport, their goodbye felt surreal. A temporary separation with no certainty of what would follow. 3 weeks until his return. Then the National Geographic assignment, a relationship built in intervals of presence and absence. "This isn't really goodbye," Julian said, holding her close. "It's just until next time." Phoebe nodded against his shoulder, memorizing the feeling of his arms around her, the scent of his jacket, the sound of his voice. Not goodbye. Just the beginning of a new chapter neither of them could have anticipated. When a reserved librarian approached a photographer holding a free hugs sign on an ordinary autumn evening. As Julian disappeared through security, Phoebe touched the compass in her pocket. North was fixed, unwavering. But there were many paths to any destination, and for the first time in her life, Phoebe was willing to explore the ones unmarked on any map she'd previously followed. The resonance of small gestures. Spring arrived in Jefferson City with a profusion of dogwood blossoms and increased activity at the library's gardening section. Phoebe helped Mrs. Landingham locate books on heirloom tomatoes, her mind drifting to the text she'd received that morning. Julian would be landing at 7:38 p.m. 4 months into their experiment in long-distance connection, and she still felt the same flutter of anticipation before each reunion. "You seem distracted today, dear," Mrs. Landingham observed, accepting the stack of gardening guides. "Is your young man coming back soon?" Phoebe smiled. "Tonight, actually." "From where this time?" "Argentina. He's been documenting water conservation efforts in rural communities." The words came easily now, Phoebe having grown accustomed to explaining Julian's work to curious patrons who'd noticed her transformation over the past months. The changes were subtle but significant. A world map now hung in Phoebe's apartment. Small pins marking locations Julian had visited or planned to see. Her bookshelf had expanded to include titles on photography, environmental activism, and cultures she'd previously known only through fiction. Most notably, a passport lay in her desk drawer, unused yet, but ready. "You know," Mrs. Landingham said, "my Harold and I spent our first 5 years married while he was in the Navy. Everyone said it wouldn't last." She patted Phoebe's hand. We celebrated our 50th anniversary before he passed. These unexpected endorsements had become common. Patrons and colleagues sharing stories of unconventional relationships that endured despite challenges. Each one felt like confirmation that what she and Julian were attempting wasn't as impossible as it sometimes seemed during the longest separations. At home that evening, Phoebe prepared for Julian's arrival. Fresh sheets on the bed, his favorite. Local beer in the refrigerator, a small stack of books she'd set aside thinking he might enjoy them. The domesticity of these gestures still surprised her. How easily she'd adapted to sharing her space intermittently, how empty it felt between his visits. Her phone chimed with a video call from Naomi. "Just checking you're not wearing that ratty Jefferson Library sweatshirt to the airport," her sister teased. Phoebe angled the phone to show her outfit, a dress Julian had never seen. Happy? Ecstatic. How long is he staying this time? 2 weeks before New Zealand. Phoebe tried to keep disappointment from her voice. Each departure grew simultaneously easier and harder. Easier because they'd developed rhythms for maintaining connection across distance. Harder because each reunion deepened what they stood to miss during separations. "Have you thought more about his suggestion?" Naomi asked. The suggestion had come during Julian's last visit, that Phoebe considered joining him for part of his New Zealand assignment. "My editor approved it," he'd said. "You could fly in for the second week, first stamp in that passport." "I'm still thinking," Phoebe answered honestly. "It's a big step." "Bigger than falling in love with a nomad?" Naomi's tone softened. "You've already taken the hardest leap, Phoebes. The rest is just logistics." At the airport, Phoebe waited at arrivals, watching travelers emerge through security. Despite monthly reunions since January, the sight of Julian still caught her breath. His tall figure moving through the crowd, eyes searching until they found hers. The smile that followed made everything, the lonely nights, the complicated scheduling, the occasional questioning from others, worth enduring. "Welcome back," she said, as his arms enveloped her. "Home," he corrected, the word carrying weight beyond the city limits. In Phoebe's apartment, now partly Julian's as well, they fell into familiar patterns, unpacking his camera equipment, sharing stories from their time apart, rediscovering the geography of each other's presence. Julian showed her photographs from Argentina, explaining the context behind each image. "This woman," he said, pointing to an elderly figure standing proudly beside a water catchment system, "reminded me of you. She looks about 80 and is wearing a poncho." Phoebe laughed. "It's the expression," Julian insisted. "The quiet determination. The way she's adapted to challenges without losing her essence." Later, curled together on the sofa, Julian asked the question Phoebe had been anticipating. "Have you decided about New Zealand?" She took a deep breath. "I've requested the time off and researched flights." Julian sat up straighter. "Really? You're coming?" "I'm terrified," Phoebe admitted. "But yes, I want to see your world, not just through your photographs." The joy in Julian's expression confirmed she'd made the right decision. "It won't be luxury travel," he warned. "Some remote locations, basic accommodations." "I know. I've been reading about it." Phoebe hesitated. "I've been doing a lot of reading, actually, about photojournalism, environmental documentation, digital archiving." Julian waited, sensing there was more. "The library is creating a new position," she continued. "Digital collection specialist. They need someone to coordinate the digitization of local historical photographs and documents, create virtual exhibitions, collaborate with regional museums on preservation efforts." "That sounds perfect for you," Julian said. "Your organizational skills, your love of preservation, your eye for meaningful narrative." "The role would require some travel," Phoebe added. "Regional mostly, but occasionally for conferences or training. And most importantly, I could work remotely for extended periods if necessary." Understanding dawned in Julian's expression. Extended periods that might coincide with a certain photographer's international assignments? Phoebe nodded. I'd still be based here. This is my home. But maybe home could be more flexible than I previously allowed. Julian took her hands. Are you sure? This is a significant shift from the life you've known. That's the point, Phoebe said with newfound confidence. 5 months ago, I was afraid to hug a stranger. Now I'm planning international travel and career changes. Not because you pushed me, but because knowing you showed me possibilities I'd never considered. Julian's eyes held a depth of emotion that made words unnecessary. In the quiet of the apartment, surrounded by elements of their intertwined lives, his cameras beside her books, maps marked with both their notations, plants she tended during his absences, they had created something neither had expected when they first met. Not just a relationship, but a shared vision that honored both their differences and their connection. The following days unfolded with plans both immediate and distant. Julian helped Phoebe prepare her application for the new position while she helped him research locations for his New Zealand assignment. They visited Naomi for dinner, went hiking in the state park, and spent an evening with Julian's local photographer, friends who had become part of their expanding social circle. One morning, Julian received an unexpected email. National Geographic is planning a feature on modern love in the digital age, he told Phoebe. They're looking for stories that challenge conventional relationship models, particularly those maintained across distance or cultural divides. And? Phoebe prompted, sensing his hesitation. They've asked if we'd consider being subjects rather than just me being the photographer. Julian watched her reaction carefully. Our story, from that first hug to now, how we're navigating this unconventional path. Phoebe, who had spent most of her life avoiding attention, found herself considering the proposal with surprising openness. Why us? There must be thousands of long-distance relationships. Because of the contrast, Julian explained. The homebody librarian and the wandering photographer. The way we're finding middle ground instead of one person completely changing for the other. Would I have to be photographed? Phoebe asked. Julian smiled. Some, but I'd be behind the camera for those parts, and we'd have editorial input. That evening, they walked to the downtown square where they'd first met. The Human Connection project had long since concluded, but the space remained a meaningful landmark in their personal geography. They sat on a bench, watching the evening. Activities around them, a yoga class on the grass, teenagers skateboarding, couples and families enjoying the spring weather. Do you ever wonder about the statistical improbability of it all? Phoebe asked, echoing Julian's words from months earlier. If Naomi hadn't insisted I attend that event, if you hadn't decided to hold that sign, if I hadn't found the courage to approach you. I think about it constantly, Julian admitted. All the microscopic decisions that had to align perfectly for us to meet. Phoebe leaned against his shoulder. When I was younger, I believed the safest path was the one with fewest variables. Fewer risks meant fewer chances for pain. And now I understand that safety can be its own kind of risk. The risk of missing everything meaningful. She looked up at the emerging stars. I'm still afraid sometimes. Of you leaving and not coming back. Of trying to merge two completely different lifestyles and failing. Julian nodded. I have fears, too, that my work will become too disruptive, that you'll resent the absences. That distance will eventually create gaps we can't bridge. But we keep trying anyway, Phoebe said. That's the point, isn't it? Not certainty, but commitment to the attempt. Exactly. Julian's arm tightened around her. And for what it's worth, I've never felt more anchored than I do with you. Like, I've found the perfect balance between exploration and belonging. As twilight deepened around them, Phoebe reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The initial hug, a simple human connection that had rippled outward. changing the contours of both their lives. Her world had expanded beyond Jefferson City's boundaries, while Julian had discovered the value of having a place and person to return to. Neither could predict how their story would unfold. The challenges of distance remained. Career demands would require compromises from both sides. Yet the foundation they'd built, one conversation, one visit, one adaptation at a time, felt surprisingly solid. "Did you ever imagine," Julian asked, "that hugging a stranger would lead to all this?" Phoebe smiled, remembering her hesitation. That first night, how terrifying it had felt to step outside her comfortable boundaries. "Never. But now I can't imagine how differently my life might have continued if I hadn't." Around them, the square filled with people pursuing their own connections, friends meeting for dinner, couples holding hands, families creating memories. Each intersection represented its own potential turning point, its own possible beginning. For Phoebe and Julian, what had begun as a momentary experiment in human connection had evolved into something neither had been seeking but both now cherished, a relationship that demanded courage and flexibility, but offered in return the profound joy of being truly seen and accepted across any distance. As they walked home hand in hand, Phoebe carried the knowledge that sometimes the most life-altering journeys begin with the smallest gestures: a hug, a photograph, a moment of openness to possibilities previously unimagined. And in that understanding lay the most valuable lesson of all, that love, in its most authentic form, doesn't require people to be identical or unchanging, but rather creates a space where both can grow, separately and together, into more complete versions of themselves.